Hi everyone. The learning outcomes for this part of Unit 10A. This is the final touch to the lecture on the Great Depression and the interwar years, assessing fascism, in particular in Nazi Germany and in Mussolini's Italy. We are going to assess authoritarianism in Japan during the interwar years. Japan has a similar state to a fascist state, but they are lacking a charismatic figure that is necessary to have a fascist state, in particular someone like Hitler in Nazi Germany or Mussolini in Italy. And Japan doesn't have that type of figure, so we call it authoritarianism as opposed to fascism. So we have been talking about Italy and comparing Italy, Germany, and now Japan, and all of these states are under the category of denying democracy. They see democracy as an institution that is weak, and they is in the leaders, and they do something to work around it. Japanese authoritarianism is a reaction to what happens in Japan in the 1920s. There is democracy and modernity and liberalism. People are influenced by the West, by the European states that won World War I, and by the United States. And this leads to a lot of influences in Japan. The women are dressing similarly to American women and listening to jazz music. There's a lot of liberal philosophies, and a lot of people participate in the political system in a democracy. There's also a great deal of economic growth, which is phenomenal overall. However, similar to most capitalist states, there's a great split in wealth from a few very, very, very wealthy and a majority of poor. And in some cases, the poor have such a hard time with famines that there are riots. One of the famous riots was the rice riot of 1918, and people were hungry and rioting because they did not have enough food to eat. And this led to severe political repression. Anyone who went against the state system was repressed violently. Then the Great Depression occurred. Starting in the 1930s in Japan, it hit hard, especially certain groups of people, in particular those who made silk. Silk is a luxury item, and when the Great Depression hits, nobody's buying silk. They're trying to buy bread to put on the table and to pay for rent or a mortgage to cover their families' heads. And there's a great deal of unemployment in Japan and a great lack of food. And it's so bad that many, many people end up selling their daughters. In this case, they sell their daughters to factories in urban areas and cities, which perhaps isn't such a bad thing, but they're basically working in slave labor conditions. And many daughters are also sold to brothels. A brothel is a place where women go to entertain men sexually. So basically these families sell their daughters to become whores, in a sense, in a very unpolitically correct way to say that. It's a very tough time in Japan. And because of that, what rises is called radical nationalism of the revolutionary right. There are some groups of junior officers in the military who rise up, and they are focused on reacting to the liberal and modern and feminist ideas that have been rising in Japan. So they are reactionary, they're reacting to those things, and they want to become more conservative and return, in a sense, to a Confucian-based system. As we all recall, I'm sure, Confucianism is based on filial piety, honor, respect, veneration, loyalty, and obedience for elderly and for the system. And these officers officers and their supporters want to go back to those good old days when things had very strict order. Women were in the home, there wasn't democracy, and there wasn't modernity, and there wasn't liberalism. So similar to what you see in Nazi Germany and in Mussolini's fascist Italy, they are very anti-democracy, anti-feminist, anti-modernity, except for technology. They still, of course, love technology. And the focus now is on loyalty and obedience to the correct way of doing things based on Confucian philosophies. And extreme nationalism arises. Nationalism, again, isn't such a bad thing. It's pride in one's nation. Every nation has some form of nationalism, and I think many of us appreciate that. We fly our flags proudly, we sing the national anthem, we go to baseball games, we eat hot dogs, and play whatever, baseball, whatever it is that we do to celebrate being an American, and that's all fine and good. But when it becomes extreme or radical, it turns violent against others, against different ways of doing things. And these radicalists want to expand into other territories, and they do this in particular in China. And this, again, is one of those reasons that China turns to Russia, because Japan going into China, nobody stops it from the West, and the West is supposed to be a supporter of China. China helped the Allied powers in World War I. China turns to the West, and the West does not stop Japan from expanding into China. So China turns to the Soviet Union, which is kind of interesting, and that's why they became a communist state. In Japan, we also have assassinations of political opponents and a failed military coup in 1936. There was a military uprising of junior officers attempting to take over the democratic government, and eventually what happens is the return of a puppet emperor who is considered a father-like figure who descended from the gods. He is really led by elite zaibatsu, those former samurai. They weren't samurai, but their grandparents were. And those zaibatsu are the political and economic leaders of Japan. And they have elected military figures. So we still have a form of democracy, but most normal people cannot be elected, and it's a very small number of people who are put into positions where they can be elected. So the idea of democracy is shunned, to put it mildly. And what's interesting about this, and what makes this an authoritarian state as opposed to a fascist state, again, is that there's no single party or charismatic leader. There is the return of that emperor, but again, he's a puppet emperor. He doesn't really have that much power. And instead, the zaibatsu are in control. Additionally, the government takes over control over all forms of information. That includes news, both on radio and in the press. Unions are not allowed, and if they are allowed, they're controlled by the government, which makes them futile. Political positions are pretty much taken over by the government, by the reactionary conservative government. And education systems, you would read textbooks with history books and information that all is pointing to the right way of doing things, that meaning based on nationalistic, revolutionary right, conservative Confucian ideas. The government and zaibatsu also control the economy. They control prices, which in some ways can be helpful. Our government controls prices in certain things as well. For example, in fruits and vegetables, if a farmer produces too much, the government pays that farmer to not sell, and instead to basically let the fruit and vegetables rot, so that the price of the apple will be $1.50 per apple and not 50 cents an apple, things like that. So in some ways it can be somewhat useful, but at the same time it's being controlled by the government and by a small group of zaibatsu economic leaders. They also control public works projects and the creation of armaments, military weaponry. And the public works projects, like building dams and bridges and streets and things to save food in, those projects lead Japan out of the Great Depression. And they are very, very successful economically, similarly to Germany. Almost all people are now employed, so the Great Depression that hit Japan so hard gets kind of overturned, and the people are doing overall much better at this time. And then lastly, there is re-education for state enemies. Now, that might seem like it's less repressive than in Italy and in Germany, which it was, because if there was a state enemy in Italy or Germany, they would be killed, as probably would be their families. In Japan, they just have to deal with re-education, but it's not like going to a community college where you sit in a class with some people who are all nice and you all learn together and it's fun and then you get to go home and do your own thing. Here, it's re-education where if you sniff in the wrong direction, they beat you, and it's pretty merciless. And so it takes years for people to be quote unquote re-educated, but basically they're just being tortured to change their perspective. In some cases, people actually believe that what they are learning eventually becomes true to them. In other cases, they realize that even if they disagree, they will never voice their opinions again because it's quite painful physically and emotionally. You're taken away from your families and again, beaten up pretty badly. And I will leave you with a lovely image. I don't know where I found this, but I think it's very exciting, of all the countries and their flags. I think that's quite marvelous how this was created. Have a wonderful afternoon or night or morning or day. Bye.